Hi, Crimies. I'm your host, MAB, and this is the Coffee and Crime Podcast. I hope you had a great weekend and that you're ready for Monday. This week, I'm going back in time once again, so information wasn't really easy to find, and I had to spend hours going through archived newspaper articles once again. I don't mind doing that, though. If you're watching the video version, you'll see that I am wearing some swag. I got some t-shirts ordered from Lynn in Moncton, New Brunswick. She is on Facebook. She is taking orders. Highly, highly, highly recommend. Her product is amazing. I'll show you my t-shirt. So it's an MAB Coffee and Crime t-shirt, and I also am a horror movie fanatic. So there's a cup here with all of my favorite horror movie characters. So absolutely amazing. So this case all started with the kidnapping of a 14-year-old boy. Please listen to the following disclaimer.
The content delivered through this podcast will at times be graphic in nature and describe criminal conduct which includes but is not limited to violence, sexual assault, and homicide. All suspects described in the podcast are considered innocent until they are found guilty in a court of law. I'm not an expert on any subjects covered, I'm just an interested party. The content will be troubling and upsetting to some people, therefore, viewer or listener discretion is advised.
I would like to welcome you to episode 13, Michael O'Leary and Aurele Bourgeois. Simon, or Cy, Stein was a Moncton restaurant owner, so the people who knew him called him Cy. He served in the army, and after that, he and his mom, Sarah Stein, opened a small coffee shop. So after the coffee shop, they ended up opening a restaurant on Main Street in Moncton. They were open for almost 50 years, but sadly, on August 7th of 2015, Cy passed away. So our story starts on a cold December night, December 13th, 1974. Simon Stein, who again was referred to Cy by the people who knew him, that night his 14-year-old son Raymond was with Sarah Stein, who is Cy's mom and Raymond's grandmother. So Raymond and his grandmother were being driven home from the restaurant by one of their employees around 10:30 p.m. So once the employee dropped the pair off, they just headed right back to the restaurant. So as usual, Raymond heads to the front door of the house to unlock the door as he had done numerous times before. But this time, nothing about this was normal, because as soon as he unlocked the door and opened the door, Raymond and Sarah stepped into the house only to be suddenly ambushed by two masked men. They were both armed with revolvers, and they pounced towards them when one of them asked where Cy was. So, probably terrified, Mrs. Stein tells them that her son Cy is still at the restaurant. Armed with this information, no pun intended, the two masked men bind Mrs. Stein's wrists, and they tie her to the railing of the stairs that sort of leads up to the upper level of the house. The men leave through a side door as if on a mission to accomplish something, taking Raymond with them. So they leave Mrs. Stein at the house, but they take 14-year-old Raymond with them. Now they need to make sure Raymond can't identify them and that he can't figure out where they're going or what he has seen. So in hopes to limit Raymond's ability to identify anything, they put a balaclava on his head backwards so that the holes are on the back of his head so that he can't see through. However, they didn't realize that the material enabled Raymond to be able to see some light and shadows, so really his vision wasn't fully compromised because of it was a thin material, so you could kind of see through it, but kind of not. So one of the men stayed with the boy outside while they waited for the other man to retrieve the car and come get them. So once they got in the vehicle and started driving towards an apartment, Raymond could identify two different voices talking. So obviously he knew that there was like him and two other people in the vehicle. The amazing thing, though, is that Raymond was able to trace the route. So during this trip, he went on a few streets and ultimately ended up on Mountain Road. They finally get to their destination, an apartment building that was mentioned earlier, and they lead Raymond inside the building where they went up 2 flights of stairs. And Raymond later testified that the stairs didn't feel like wood or they didn't feel like carpet either. So they were probably sort of like a concrete material. They ended up in a carpeted room at the end of the hall. The two men started talking in the room, and not long after, one of the two asked Raymond for money. So Raymond gave one of the men $10, the only $10 he had on him. This man leaves the apartment and returns a short time later with a cooked chicken and some Coke. Like Coke to drink, not Coke to sniff. So after they ate, they just kind of stayed in the apartment and chilled for a few hours, and then they took Raymond back out to the car. Edit. Again, because Raymond was aware of his surroundings in the car, he knew that there was one man in the backseat with him and one driving, but he couldn't confirm whether someone else was in the car with them or not because everyone was so quiet. They were not having a conversation this time. So he couldn't even determine how many passengers were in the car by their voices. And the car headed to Riverview Mall. So they parked and they waited until a Thunderbird pulled up at a distance. A bag was dropped off containing $15,000 in $10 bills. Man, I can't even imagine. Like, at least make it $100 bills. I don't know. $10 bills seems a little excessive. And this Thunderbird, it was only about 300 feet from the car where the men were holding Raymond captive. Now, let's go over things from, I guess, basically Cy's point of view or Cy's perspective. After the men got the money, they actually released Raymond back to Cy, his father. And listen, I can't even imagine what was going through either one's head, honestly, and Raymond had been so brave. I don't know that every child would be able to concentrate enough or put their emotions aside enough to really pinpoint where they had been, what routes they took. Like, that takes a lot of bravery. Anyway, good job, Raymond. So while all this was happening, about 20 or 30 minutes after being bound by her wrists, Mrs. Stein was actually able to free herself. So as soon as she was free, her instant reaction was to place a call to the restaurant to speak with her son, who rushed to be with her. So when Cy gets to the house to make sure his mom's okay, a phone call comes in, and the man on the other end, who Cy doesn't recognize, tells him he has his son and demands a ransom. So naturally, Cy rushes to his restaurant to see how much cash he has on hand. Does he have enough to satisfy the kidnappers? So while he's there, he receives a second call, which led him to call Milton Palmer, who was a manager at the Bank of Nova Scotia at the time. After a quick conversation between them, Cy tells the bank he needs $15,000 cash. And then this is when the third call comes in, and I'm not sure what was said during this call because I literally couldn't find any details. So shortly after, the branch manager and his bank accountant deliver the money to Cy's residence. At 3:30 in the morning, after the branch manager left, is when Cy receives a fourth and final call. The call lasted about 7 minutes, and depending on what article I found, one said from 3:30 to 3:37. Other articles differed in time, but they all had the same information that the call was about 7 minutes long, and the call was not traced. So during this call, clear instructions were provided with where, when, and how to deliver the ransom money. So here's the thing. The Moncton police had actually failed to notify the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, because the RCMP would have been the ones who had jurisdiction over the Moncton and Riverview areas. Well, because of this negligence, no roadblocks were set up until after Raymond was actually reunited with his dad. So clearly not as effective as they could have been. And I'm not saying anything negative about the Moncton police force either, because I wasn't there. We're all human. We all make mistakes. It happened. It is what it is. So I'll try to break down this part without complicating it more than it already is. So 4 police cruisers were dispatched to the Riverview Mall area. The ironic thing is that 2 of the police cars actually passed Cy's Thunderbird as he was heading back to his restaurant with his son. So one of the cruisers was parked in a private driveway, and they could actually see them all from that location. A second officer set up the roadblocks, and a third cruiser with 2 officers inside went to the east of the first cruiser that was parked in a driveway. Both policemen were armed with a revolver, and there was also a shotgun in the vehicle. I'm not sure where the shotgun was. I couldn't find any information about that, but I would assume that police officers would put the shotgun in the trunk unless there's a different protocol for carrying armed weapons. So I'll call this vehicle the driveway cruiser, and it was occupied by detectives Cairns, Cassidy, and Cudmore. And as they're sitting in the cruiser, they spot a 1968 to 1970 two-door Cadillac. It was light beige. Some reports call it gold, but it was light beige with a darker top, and they also spotted a blue Dodge. Now, the odd thing is that as the Cadillac was driving along, they turned the headlights off and headed on to Salisbury Road. What's even weirder is that they never turned the headlights back on. And as the cruiser with the 3 officers started to follow the Dodge vehicle, one of the office radios Corporal Bourgeois and Constable O'Leary, and they dispatched them to go check what's going on with the Cadillac with no lights. So, I'm glad that the driver of the Cadillac turned the light off, because that's what triggered officers to wonder what was going on and to kind of think something not right was happening, but not very smart on the criminals' end, because if you're trying not to draw attention to your vehicle, well, you're doing something wrong. So after this, no word from the officers. They were missing. Nobody heard from them. Nobody knew where they were. But not for long, because only 2 days later, on December 15th, 1974, the bodies of Aurele Bourgeois and Michael O'Leary were found in shallow graves that they were forced to dig themselves. When they were found, they were covered by a thin blanket of fresh, light snow. They had both been shot in the head, and they each had a handcuff locked to one wrist. The shovel that was used for the policemen to dig their own graves was also found at the scene, but it was found a couple feet away from where the graves were. When the officer found the shovel, he wrote the date that he found the shovel on the handle of the shovel, and this was later questioned in trial. So, I have a side note here, and I don't want to, if somebody, and I don't know because I've never been in that position. Hopefully I never will be. What would you do if somebody asked you to dig your own grave? Because I'm not in that situation, I'm probably, removed from how I would actually react. But I guess you have hope that if you dig your grave and you listen, that they will let you live. However, most of the time they don't. So if you're going to kill me anyway, excuse me, sir, but you're going to dig my hole. I'm not breaking a sweat before I die. And an interesting tidbit is that Richard Ambrose and James Hutchison were the first 2 to be sentenced to death in Canada, and they received their sentences on April Fool's Day. Imagine that. However, capital punishment was abolished before these 2 got to experience it, because June 22nd of 1976, it was announced that a bill to abolish capital punishment had passed the majority vote. This is also when Ambrose looked at his partner in crime in prison and said, quote, "Now we can get all the pigs," end quote. July 12th, 1976. There's a trial regarding errors in charge and circumstantial evidence. So basically, Hutchison and Ambrose were saying that there were errors in their trial. And before that, I had no idea what a learned trial judge was, so I had to Google it. I'll share it with you guys. A learned trial judge is a judge with extensive knowledge and experience in the law, particularly in the context of trial proceedings. The term emphasizes their deep understanding of legal principles, precedents, and courtroom procedures, making them a well-equipped and respected figure in the judicial system. So the learned trial judge said that basically the evidence wasn't separated for which accused it was pertinent to versus the other. The two accused were jointly charged, and the evidence was also applied jointly, not individually. So they didn't separate, like, this person did this and that person did that. Some evidence that was applicable to one accused may not be applicable to the other accused. So the argument made sense in a way because they can't really be considered as one person. They're two different human beings. The judge said, quote, "I'm obliged to review here the theory of the defense, and Mr. Bell has outlined it extremely well and dealt with all aspects of the defense. And I have touched it on some of the things I had to say." End quote. Essentially, he goes on to say that there were gaps in the Crown's case, which makes beyond a reasonable doubt harder to prove. The burden is on the Crown to satisfy the guilt of the accused, again, beyond a reasonable doubt. Mr. Bell had put forward some theories very adequately and had pointed out what, undoubtedly, were some discrepancies. So during the course of this trial, 76 witnesses were called by the Crown, and the evidence that was described and printed on paper was 1,371 pages long. That's a lot. It was believed that the murderers probably had the intention of kidnapping Cy, but the events unrolled differently and didn't go as planned, so they ended up with his son Raymond instead. In the end, the judge basically said that in reviewing all the evidence of the case, it was so overwhelming that no reasonable jury would come to any other conclusion than both parties being found guilty of the murders. So both appeals were dismissed, and the convictions of both Hutchison and Ambrose remained. Amazing. So I'm not sure when, but at some point, Richard Ambrose also changed his last name to Bourgeois. And apparently in 2019, he was looking for love. And we had talked about that, I believe it was in the episode with Penny Boudreau, right? Because she was looking for something behind bars. And now we have Richard Ambrose / Bergeron doing the same thing. So I guess all prisoners are looking for love. At the ripe age of 70 years old, on his profile at the time, it said, quote, "I survived the death penalty in Canada," end quote. It was almost as if this double killer was bragging. And also, Richard, you didn't survive the penalty because of anything good you did. It's just because it was actually abolished. So keep bragging. Now, just to give everyone an idea of how crime affects many people, the daughter of attorney Mr. Bell wrote a book. Ed Bell was very well known in Moncton, and he was also very involved with the Liberal Party before leaving his law profession and moving to a secluded area with his daughter and son. Amy Bell is a history professor at Huron University College in London, Ontario. In a news article, it states that her father was in Moncton so much during the trial that it ended his marriage. She also wrote a book called Life Sentence: How My Father Defended Two Murderers and Lost Himself. The story he always told people was that he was a retired first aid instructor, and even on his deathbed, he kept all of his secrets. Amy was only a year old at the time, and this is a perfect example of how crime can affect families other than those of the murderers or the victims. The effect trickles. I also feel it's worth mentioning that when Mr. Bell accepted to take on the case, The officers were missing and they hadn't been found yet. So he didn't knowingly take the case on, knowing that he would be defending two cop killers. So back to Ambrose, he wrote on Prisoner Connect that due to a brain injury he suffered from an industrial accident, he doesn't remember what happened the day of the crimes. He wrote, quote, "Many women may be curious about my original crime in 1974, but because of my brain injury, I don't and can't remember my crime." End quote. Okay, Richard. Between the two officers lost, a total of 6 kids were left without fathers. What a sin. Ambrose was actually released on parole in 2000. However, he just can't stay away or be good enough to stay out, and he was in prison again 5 years later for assaulting his partner and threatening his sister. In an article from 2015, Matthew Yeager, a criminologist at the University of Western Ontario, said Hutchison shouldn't have died in prison. And I found this part really, I don't know, I have opinions. He said, quote, "He's feeble, he has heart disease, he has oxygen deprivation issues, he's in a wheelchair, he's a minimum security inmate, and a fact not in dispute is that his risk level for escape or further crimes are lower than the average minimum security inmate." End quote. Seriously? I know he's a human, I get that, but he was a bad human. So why should we be expected to take pity on him? He did the crime, now let him do his time. Throughout the years, Hutchison was said to be unrepentant. So he has never, ever expressed or shown remorse for the crimes he committed. Yet we're supposed to let him out of prison because he's frail and sick? Nay, nay. They have nurses in prison to take care of him. He's fine there. In a CBC News article from 2017, it says that Ambrose was denied parole on February 1st. He was 68 at the time, and even though he appealed the decision, it was maintained in a June 29th ruling. Ambrose also had requested 3 unescorted temporary absences. I also have an opinion about this one. So one of the absences he requested was to attend a program in the community, one to go to a bank, a jewelry store, a real estate company to purchase land, and last but not least, a dental appointment. They were all denied, thankfully. So I think I had read somewhere, and I didn't want to cover all of Ambrose's history prior to these crimes because he was like a career criminal. So he had done all of the things. And I'm pretty sure one of them was armed robbery. So what makes you think that they're going to let you out of prison on, whether it's escorted or not, to go to a bank or a jewelry store? No. And also you're in prison for life with no chance of parole. So why would you need a piece of land? Like, none of this makes sense to me. And I think it was just a ruse to, I don't know, maybe try to escape or something. And if you're wondering why I haven't mentioned parole requests for Hutchison, well, that's because he died in prison in 2011 at the age of 83. So Michael O'Leary was born in 1941 in St. John, New Brunswick, and he was 33 at the time of the murders. Aurele Bourgeois was 47 and lost his life the same day. His son Sean spoke during a memorial service honoring his father in 2024, which marked 50 years from the murders. I also saw that as the body of Corporal Aurele Bourgeois was being carried out at the Assumption Cathedral in Moncton, the 8-year-old son of the murdered officer, Guy, was fighting back tears behind his dad's coffin. And you know how there's like these images from a National Geographic and things like that that just pull some heartstrings? For me, this was one of them. Honestly, it's an image that I'll never be able to get out of my head. Charlie Bourgeois, Aurele's son, said he was only 13 when this happened, when he lost his dad. And 50 years later, he still remembers the pain that his mother and siblings had to endure. Here's more information I found about the crime in the newspaper, too. So, in a Times and Transcript article from Wednesday, February 5th, 1975, Hutchison was actually the one to call Sergeant Cahoon around 9 p.m. one night to have a conversation about turning himself in. He was then encouraged to turn himself in as Cahoon stroked his ego by telling him that he was so famous that there was no way that he'd have a place to hide because everyone would recognize him. Sergeant Greg Cahoon, who was a 37-year-old former drug squad specialist, appeared to be one of the key people in the arrest of James Hutchison. I guess at the time, not only did James know the sergeant, but he also trusted him. And side note here, they didn't elaborate on how the trust had developed or where it came from or how long they had known each other. However, kind of like the Mr. Big Stings or drug force officers, they usually try to build relationships with these criminals in order to put them behind bars or so that they can obtain information later on. So I'm guessing this is why there was trust established, but there's no confirmation on that, just personal opinion. So after about 2 hours of phone calls to negotiate, the arrest finally happened. James was charged in the kidnapping of 14-year-old Raymond Stein and the subsequent deaths of Corporal Aurele Bourgeois and Michael O'Leary. Something else I found pretty interesting is that Mr. Weatherby, who was at the time president of the Dorchester Penitentiary, said a softball had been found by a guard inside the wall of the pen with words on it that said, "Goods haven't come yet, ready on Friday." So the ball was found in June by a patrol dog who saw it, and it seemed to have been thrown over the prison wall. So it ended up kind of like in the yard of the prison. So after finding this ball, evidently the night watch was increased to make sure that nothing came in or out of the prison. Mr. Weatherby also said, quote, "I personally feel, as do many others, that the softball incident and the finding of the revolver was directly related to an escape plan between Ambrose and Hutchison," end quote. He said that because after the whole ball incident, a .32 caliber revolver and 15 rounds of ammunition were also discovered. And fun fact about this one, my mom was around 10 at the time, and she lived with my grandmother and my two aunts, so her mom and her two sisters, at the corner of Archibald and Mountain Road in Moncton. My family was inside their second floor apartment when my mom, who was literally the size of a flea, like my mom was tiny and probably this big, heard a knock at the door, so she went to answer the door. And when she opened the door, two cops were standing with guns drawn because they were looking for Ambrose. They thought maybe he was in the attic, on the roof. They didn't know, but they had to find him. So the police made them all huddle in my grandmother's room until they were done searching the apartment and the roof and surrounding area. And she remembers being so scared, and I cannot even imagine what that would have been like. So, this is it, Crimies. I know this episode was a little longer. I probably could have done a 2-part and gathered a bunch more information. I just didn't feel like a lot of the information I found was pertinent to the case. So I just picked out the most important information and put it together for you. So thank you so much for listening once again. Please, please, please like, share, follow, do all of the things as I usually ask. I really appreciate you, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. And remember, crime is a waste of time. Catch you next Sunday for an all-new episode. Until next time, bye, Crimies.